course we're going to be doing, the course I'm going to be your guide through is the conservative intellectual tradition in America. We're going to take a survey of the political tradition of modern conservatism in the United States. And we're going to look for its broader roots in the Western political tradition. And we're going to give specific attention later on to the 20th and 21st centuries. We're going to examine how it happened, where it came from, and where we are today. There's a number of people who made this possible, and they need to be thanked. And they need to be thanked in multiple ways, but I'm only going to thank them in one up here by one big thank you. And obviously, General John Rosa, without his support, this would never have come about. Provost Sam Hines continued to push to have this done. Commandant Leo Mercado, Dean Bowmoor, Francis Frame from the Republican Club, a professor here, and just a host of other people, including my department chairman, Gardel Furtado. There's also a number of other people who have been working to set this up, led by just a terrific guy who I've gotten to know, Jeff Perez, who's probably scurrying around trying to make things happen still, and his team have just, including Jennifer Wallace and Gervais Haggerty, have just been invaluable in making this work. And there's a graduate by the name of Nancy Mace has been putting in her time on a pro bono basis. I think she was the first female cadet to graduate from the Citadel, who has a PR firm who's been trying to get this put together. And I thank all of them from the bottom of my heart for making this unique experiment possible. It is truly unusual to be able to do something like this, and I am just so proud again to be your host through the next 13 sessions of this. This is the conservative intellectual tradition in America. It's a course that I'm going to be traveling with you through. I'm Mallory Factor. I'm the John C. West Professor of International Politics and American Government here at the Citadel. This course is made possible by the Citadel as well as ISI, and the people at ISI have just been invaluable in helping put this course together. Our first speaker, who will be looking at really the introduction and the introduction to the conservative intellectual tradition. He's going to be stepping us through this. He is the guy, he is the man who was responsible for the content that the conservative movement in America really needed at a time when there was not a lot of media out there. We forget that the internet is relatively new, and the myriad of television stations were not in existence not too long ago. He's currently the president and publisher of the American Spectator, which is a monthly magazine of politics, international affairs, and culture. He served in the Justice Department during the Reagan administration, worked on the U.S. Senate staff, and has been in private law practice. But what he's best known for is publishing 22 New York Times bestsellers during his tenure at Regnery Publishing. People such as Ann Coulter, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, columnist Michelle Malkin, pundit David Horowitz, they all owe a great debt of gratitude to this man who really got them going and got the movement going. He's also the author of a book which I've recently had the opportunity to read, and I'm telling you, it is a phenomenal book and a read that it gives you a real background on the ascendance of American conservatism. It's called Upstream. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce the chairman of the board of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, our co-sponsor, the Honorable Alfred S. Regnery.
Thank you very much, Mallory, and thank all of you for being here today. I can't tell you what a privilege it is for me to lead off this phenomenal series of talks that you're going to have over the next 12 or 13 weeks. I must say I'm enormously impressed by the outline that you've put together, the list of speakers that you'll have, and gosh, by the time you're done, you will have probably the best foundation of what's going on in right-of-center America of anybody that is around. I wish many times that I had had the privilege of sitting through such a course myself. As I've told many people, I was really brought up in the conservative movement. My father started a publishing company in 1947 that initially published people like Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk, Whittaker Chambers, many, many others, and those people often came through our house when I was growing up, and my father was also the chairman of ISI, by the way, so I heard all of this as I was growing up. I was active in college. My life has really been, my professional life, part of the conservative movement. But when I sat down to write this book, I realized there was an awful lot that I didn't know. And I think even people that are very much involved in the conservative political movement today many times don't really have any idea what lies behind it all, where it came from. So let me give you something of a sketch, as much as I can in an hour, about some of the philosophical foundations of the conservative movement and some of the other things. Conservatism has, over the past 50 years or so, become the dominant political philosophy in the United States. Any newspaper or magazine article and television news or background report, anything else having to do with politics, more often than not, will mention the word conservative. Almost every Republican candidate running for office, whether it's for the county clerk or president of the United States, will try to establish his position on the political spectrum based on how conservative he is. To a lesser extent, although much less than they did 20 years ago, Democrats, particularly in the South and West, sometimes even distinguish between members of the party as being more or less conservative. Similarly, in economic policy, tax policy, foreign affairs, social issues, and the culture more generally, much is measured by just how conservative the policy happens to be. You will often hear people speaking of the conservative movement, which can be defined as the great body of organizations, committees, political activists, politicians, think tanks, periodicals, talk show hosts, bloggers, and the rest who are actively involved in conservative politics. I suppose you could say that I'm part of that movement and have been for most of my adult life. Although conservatism as we know it today is a relatively new movement, it really only emerged on the scene after World War II and only became a political force in the 1960s. It is based on ideas that are old as Western civilization. The basic tenets of conservatism, the philosophical or intellectual foundations on which this movement has been built, stretch back to antiquity, were further developed during the Middle Ages in the 18th and 19th centuries in England, and ultimately formulated into a coherent political philosophy at the time of the founding of the United States. In fact, in a real sense, conservatism is Western civilization. What I want to do today is first talk about what the ideas that underlie contemporary conservative thinking are in very broad terms. Then I'll talk about how those ideas were woven together to form the basis for American conservatism, largely by the founders, with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And finally, I'll describe how those documents serve as the foundation for modern American conservatism, what it is, how it came to be, and how modern conservatism relates to the foundations that I will talk about first. I like to boil the very basic foundations of American conservatism down into four fundamental concepts. Call them the four pillars of modern conservatism. First is liberty, or freedom. Conservatives believe that the individual possesses the right to life, liberty, property, and freedom from the restrictions of arbitrary force. They exercise these rights through the use of their natural free will. That means the ability to follow your own dreams, to do what you want to do so long as you don't harm other people, and to reap the rewards. Above all, it means freedom from oppression by government and the protection by government against oppression. It means political liberty, or the freedom to speak your mind and advocate any political position that suits your fancy. It means religious liberty, to worship as you please. But it also means the liberty not to have to do any of those things either. It also means economic liberty and the freedom to allocate resources by the free play of supply and demand and the free market system that follows from it. In addition, it means the freedom to own property and to use that property accordingly. Conservative philosophy is based on the notion that the pursuit of virtue is the purpose of our existence, and that liberty is an essential component of the pursuit of virtue. Adherence to virtue is a necessary component of the pursuit of freedom. In other words, that freedom will be pursued for the common good, and then when it is abused for the benefit of one group at the expense of another, it must be controlled. Over the course of history, people came to realize that the greatest threats to liberty are the demands of government, whether that government be a monarchy, a democracy, or a dictatorship, or whatever else. On the other hand, people also realized that there are some things that government must control, and finding the right balance is often at the root of the question of more or less government, as we will see later in this lecture. But at the end of the day, conservative philosophy in the choice between more security or more liberty will usually opt for more liberty. The second pillar of conservative philosophy is tradition and order. Conservative philosophy is also about conserving the values that have been established over centuries and which have led to an orderly society. It is belief in human nature and the ability of man to build an orderly society that respects human rights and that has the capacity to repel the forces of evil. Order means a systematic and harmonious arrangement, both within one's own character and in the state of the Commonwealth. It signifies the performance of certain duties and the enjoyment of certain rights in a community, such as used in the phrase the civil social order. Order is necessary for life and the pursuit of our dreams, and is perhaps more easily understood by looking at its opposite, disorder. A disordered existence is a confused and miserable existence. If a society falls into general disorder, many of its members will cease to exist at all. And if the members of a society are disordered in spirit, the outward order of society cannot endure. Disorder describes well what conservatism is not. And as an aside, I guess those of you at the Citadel know what order is all about. The third pillar is the rule of law. Conservative philosophy is based on the belief that it is crucial to have a legal system that is predictable and orderly, that allows people to know what the rules are and to be able to enforce those rules equally for all citizens. It means that the government, as well as the governed, is subject to the law, and it means all people are to be equally protected by the law. The rule of law promotes prosperity, and it protects liberty. It means, as John Adams famously said, a government of laws and not men. Another way to put it is simply that it means justice. The fourth pillar is belief in God. Belief in God means adherence to the broad concepts of religious faith, things like justice, virtue, fairness, charity, community, duty. They are the concepts on which conservatives base their philosophy. Conservative belief is tethered to the idea that there is an allegiance to God which transcends politics and which sets the standard on which politics is based. For conservatives, there must be an authority which is greater than man, and which is greater than any ruler, king, or government, so that no state can demand our absolute obedience or attempt to control every aspect of our lives. There must be a moral order, conservatives believe, that lies behind political order. Belief in God as part of conservative foundational philosophy does not mean mixing up faith and politics, and it does not mean setting religious disputes politically or vice versa. It also does not mean that all conservatives believe in God, nor do they have a monopoly on such belief. Each of these four pillars is related to the other closely. Each incorporates the concepts of all of the others, and each is dependent on the other. Liberty, for example, is considered a gift of God and must be protected by and is dependent on the rule of law. The rule of law itself, conservatives believe, is dependent on the natural law, the law that transcends from a source beyond human perception and which is reflected in every orderly and civilized society. It is the law that distinguishes between good and evil. Tradition and order are best reflected by the common law, the law developed over centuries by reasonable people in their everyday lives and experiences, and which sets the rules for social order consistent with the past. And tradition and order are a great component of belief in God. What could demonstrate tradition and order more fully, for example, than the Old Testament and the history of the Jews or the doctrines of Christianity, and particularly the Catholic Church? I have mentioned some of the origins where those four pillars were conceived, but it's interesting to look at them from another perspective, one which solidifies the historical origins of the conservative tradition. Russell Kirk, who's probably the most preeminent conservative scholar and philosopher of the 20th century, spoke of the four great cities where the foundations were laid. Those cities are Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and how what originated in those four cities culminated in a fifth great city, Philadelphia, in the late 18th century. Remembering those four cities and learning what happened in each is a good way to remember just where the philosophical underpinnings of modern American conservative come from, how they were knit together, and how they evolved into this modern political philosophy. Let's look at the four cities one by one and see what it was that evolved from each, and how what emanated from those four cities relates to the four pillars. The first is Jerusalem, where the concept of a transcendent order originated. The understanding that true law comes from God and that God is the source of order and justice. From Jerusalem came one of the most essential ideas of conservatism, that man is subservient to God, that man does not have all the answers, and that there is a greater power than man to which we owe our lives and all else that we have. The Hebrews in the Old Testament taught that God made a covenant or compact with his people. He decreed laws by which they should live, and from that revelation, man developed modern ethics and modern law. That compact forms the very basis of the political order. The second city is Athens, where the ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, described the basis of the social order, what was required for people to live together and to thrive in society. Ethics and politics are, they believed, at the root of man's existence. Ethics is what establishes one's character, and politics is the means by which the state can attain man's desires. Aristotle, whose writings have had profound influence on conservative thought, understood the needs of the individual and his relationship to community. Man is a social animal, he taught, and only recognizes his talents and how to use them for the common good if he is part of the broader community of man. The Greek philosophers, however, added nothing to the argument for liberty. In fact, Greek philosophy advocated untrammeled power by the state and total subjugation of the individual by the state. The third city in this progression is Rome, where we learn of the highest form of government, the Republic, and the use of the separation of powers and checks and balances for the control of political power and the efficient development of government. Rome also provided the very idea of the rule of law, how law was necessary to preserve order and liberty, and how it needed to be reliable and consistent. Until the Roman Republic collapsed in 43 BC, the Roman philosophers, people such as Cato, Marcus Aurelius, and Cicero, taught us about virtue as a necessary component to the rule of law, forces necessary to restrain the passions of men and to preserve liberty. Another of the great lessons from Rome was the concept of order. Roman civilization defined order in a world where anarchy and disorder reigned. The Roman Empire, which followed the Republic, taught little, of course, about individual liberty, but a great deal about the use of power. Finally, there's London, where the teachings that helped to establish the foundations of conservatism stretch from the Middle Ages to the end of the 18th century and beyond. The foundation started with a Magna Carta in 1215 and evolved into the concept of the common law, which was ultimately adopted in the United States, and the idea that the law applies equally to everybody, whether it's the king or the lowest citizens. The Magna Carta and the common law also taught the concept of the permanence of the law, that principle of the supremacy of the law, meaning that an enduring law exists and must be obeyed by all men. William Blackstone, a professor at Oxford, later a judge, published his commentaries on the laws of England in 1765. He argued in a massive 4-volume work that natural law was the basis of all law, was rooted in Christian ethics, and declared that man had innate rights to personal security, to personal liberty, and to private property. But he also argued that those rights were not absolute. When one lived in a society or community, he had to give up certain of those rights as the price for the mutual commerce that he enjoyed. Call it a social contract. It is a fundamental doctrine of American politics and central to conservative philosophy. The influence that British political commentators and intellectuals had on conservative philosophy could fill many books, and have done so. Among those whose thought is central to conservative philosophy include John Locke, John Stuart Mill, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and most importantly, Edmund Burke. Burke was an Irishman, a member of the House of Commons, and is probably the closest thing to being the intellectual father of American conservatism that there is. Among his most important contributions to conservative thinking are his writings concerning the wisdom of tradition and order. Specifically, he believed that the wisdom of any one individual was minuscule as compared to the collective wisdom accumulated by our ancestors over the centuries, and that understanding such collective wisdom was crucial to maintaining an orderly and productive society. To Burke, habit, instinct, custom, faith, reverence, prejudice, the accumulated practical knowledge acquired through experience was more important than abstract reasoning. Collectively, and for better or worse, it constituted man's nature. Tradition, in other words, was crucial to the good of a society, but so was obedience to laws. If laws are reasonable, Burke believed, the benefit of security compensates for the diminishing of perfect freedom to do whatever one wishes. But arbitrary laws and arbitrary government was what was to be feared the most. Excuse me just a second. Edmund Burke gave conservatism much more than I can possibly mention today. But among the most important lessons was that of the classical virtue of prudence, the art of calculating the eventual results of policies and actions, of avoiding extremes, of shunning haste. The teachings that came from Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London then all came together in a fifth city, Philadelphia, where from 1776 until 1987, the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution were drafted, debated, and adopted, and the United States was founded. The founders, who can be described as the fathers of the American conservative cause, were highly educated and well-read men. They had studied the Bible, they had read the classics, and the British political philosophers, and knew the history of Western civilization and how it melded together the orders of the soul. That is, what they had learned from the Bible and the mind, the teachings of Greece and Rome, and the polity of what had filtered down through Western civilization, largely in Britain, to form what would endure as the greatest experiment in history in a state formed on the concept of liberty, morality, and justice. It also served as the foundation of American conservatism. So let me tell you something about these two amazing documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States. The Declaration of Independence dissolved the relationship, first of all, between the American people and Britain, and formed a new independent nation, the United States of America. It set out the moral vision of the new nation and suggested the form of government that would later be established. It also established a theory of what a legitimate government should be, and then spoke in both general terms and specific complaints of how British rule had violated those principles. Many of the settlers, of course, had come to America from Europe because they were being oppressed and they wanted to be free. They wanted to worship as they saw fit, to speak their minds, and to earn a living freely. But over the years, under British rule, those were things that were supposed to be protected by the British, but were not. And the Declaration set out a list of 28 abuses by the king. Things like taxation without consent, denial of trial by jury, denial of religious liberty, freedom of speech, and so on. The social contract, in other words, had been broken with the result that the colonists declared that they owed no further allegiance to the King of England. The first phrase in the Declaration's principal passage is perhaps its most important. It sets forth the most basic belief of the founders. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've all heard those words many times, but think about what they mean. Here the founders are talking about natural law, stating that natural law is a higher law than that made by mankind, that natural law establishes the difference between right and wrong. The Declaration of Independence then goes on to say that to secure these God-given rights, governments are instituted by men. In other words, that natural law is the foundation on which man-made law is built. Then the Declaration says that only governments are legitimate which operate by the consent of the governed, and that the governed have the right, again, God-given, to change it or abolish it. To say it another way, the Declaration says there's no divine right of kings, there's no absolute power of government. Instead, whatever right to power there is only derives from the people. It makes it clear that we are born with these rights, which means that every person has equal rights and can pursue them as they see fit. The only legitimate function of a government was to secure those rights, and again, could only do so with the consent of the people. So the Declaration limited the power of the government not once, but twice. Once by its purpose or ends, and once by its function or means, which was our consent. 11 years later, after the Revolutionary War was won and the English had withdrawn from our shores, the Constitution was drafted and ratified by the 13 states. The Constitution was designed to be the supreme law of the land, the law which established the new government, established its structure, and spelled out how it would work. The Constitution reflects the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence. The dilemma the founders faced was how to create a government that would be powerful enough to protect the rights established by the Declaration from both within the country and from abroad, while still providing sufficient checks and balances that the new government wouldn't have so much power as to overturn those rights. So let's take a look at how the drafters of the Constitution solved that dilemma. The Constitution first establishes the three branches of the federal government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, and sets forth what the duties of each one are. It sets forth the role of the states and gives the states power to do things that the federal government is not specifically tasked with doing. It gives the citizens of the U.S. a set of protections against government power and gives them a way of protecting themselves against the abuses of that power. It enumerates the powers of the federal government, and it gives it none that are not enumerated. The Constitution also establishes a powerful system of checks and balances, so that no branch of the government would become too powerful. First, through the doctrine of the separation of powers, each of these three branches limit the power of the other two. For example, there are two houses of Congress, which must agree on any legislation passed. Any bill passed by Congress must be then signed by the President to become law. The President can also reject the legislation through a veto, and Congress has the power to override the veto. And the courts can review anything that either Congress or the executive branch does and rule it unconstitutional or outside the scope of the law. It further limits federal power. In order to further limit federal power, the Constitution establishes the idea of federalism by giving power to the states and establishes the fact that all power not given directly to the federal government belongs to the states. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, when taken together, were the work of not of a moment, an hour, or even a lifetime, but of 2,000 years of Western thought, political struggle, and hard-won knowledge about the state. They are the almost perfect summation of the four pillars that we've been talking about, all rolled into two compact documents in which are the practical codification of the doctrines of modern American conservatism. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in fact, have been called the most perfect and most successful conservative documents in the history of the world. In sum, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution incorporate the four pillars of conservative thought into the establishment of the United States. Now let's examine how they do that. First is the concept of liberty and the necessity of protecting liberty from the abuses of state power. The founders recognized that government was necessary, but also recognized that unless its powers were strictly limited, it could threaten the freedoms it was founded to protect. The Bill of Rights, of course, provided for the most essential liberties that could not be infringed by the government. Second is the rule of law. To protect the freedoms granted by the Constitution, a fixed and certain rule of law was necessary. As the founders saw it, a system in which the ruling power could alter the Constitution and the law as it pleased, and thus expand the scope of its authority, was a system in which freedom was imperiled. There could be no arbitrary decrees, and justice would be settled by fixed rules and duly authorized judges. The Constitution could be amended, but to do so is an arduous and cumbersome process that required both houses of Congress to approve the amendment by a 2/3 majority and to have 3/4 of the states approve it as well. So the Constitution was the ultimate bedrock law of the land, providing certainty and predictability to the American people. The third is order and tradition. First, as mentioned, the Constitution was the culmination of nearly 2,000 years of Western civilization and Western thought. Further, the founders recognized that a government was needed to provide defense, administer justice, and otherwise supply a zone of order in which people could go in safety about their business. It established the idea of continuity and the stability of leadership, providing for an orderly process of choosing leaders, making law, and administering the new republic. And finally, belief in God. Both documents reflect the great reverence that the founders had for their understanding of the Bible. The Declaration of Independence both opens by saying men are endowed by their Creator and closes speaking of the laws of nature and nature's God and the supreme judge of the world. The Constitution, although less explicit than the Declaration, recognizes the liberties discussed in the Declaration and protects them as almost sacred. It also goes to great lengths to protect religious liberty, something the founders believed to be an integral part of a free society, and believed that the free exercise of religion would have a positive effect on the workings of the government. Sadly, the founders' concept of religious liberty has now been turned on its head by the Supreme Court, but that is a topic for another day. It's no wonder that many conservatives now call themselves constitutional conservatives. Why the Tea Party has adopted the Constitution as its standard text, and why the conservative legal community has resurrected the Constitution as its fundamental document. The Constitution sets forth the basic tenets of conservatism in clear and unambiguous language. It is brief but complete and still stands as the very bedrock foundation of American conservatism. If you're ever asked what conservatism in America stands for, you can say it stands for what's in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and you will have given a pretty good answer. So how does all of this help us define what American conservatism is all about in the 21st century? When we listen to a newscaster defining Newt Gingrich as more conservative than Mitt Romney, or when we hear Ron Paul described as a libertarian or Rick Santorum as a social conservative, how can we apply these principles I've just spelled out to help us understand what all of this means? First, let me give you a thumbnail sketch of the history of the modern American conservative movement, which should help you understand just what is going on today. As World War II drew to a close, America was culturally a conservative place, but politically not conservative at all. And the growth of government and the domination of economic activity by Washington were in full growth mode. All three branches of government were controlled by left-leaning Democrats. Communist Russia had been our ally during the war, and Uncle Joe Stalin was still considered a benevolent figure. Great Britain was largely a socialist state. Opinion makers were all pretty much in agreement concerning politics and economics. In short, the liberals were in control. The word conservative was never used, and there was no conservative movement. But within several years after 1945, conservative intellectuals began to speak out about what they viewed as a dangerous drift of the United States toward socialism. There was a group, first of all, of libertarian economists led by Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, both Austrians, who wrote about economics and the virtues of free market capitalism and free markets. Socialism, Hayek wrote, was the road to serfdom, and a free market economics was the only way for Europe to rebuild and for the U.S. to combat the growing communist and socialist threat coming from Russia and Europe. These libertarians advocated limited government instead of socialism, self-reliance instead of the welfare state, private property and entrepreneurship instead of government involvement in the means of production and central planning. Chaos, they wrote, was the alternative. Chaos and world poverty. The second group believed that the primary threat to the West and to Western civilization was the spread of communism, as witnessed the Soviet Union and China, which exerted their influence around the world and attempted to subvert American culture and the American way of life internally. Communism represented everything abhorrent to Western values. It was tyrannical, repressive, socialistic, atheistic. It used terror, deceit, and subversion for its ends, and was determined to force its ideology on the rest of the world. Communism's goals included the destruction of tradition and order in the rest of the world, and it defied the rule of law. The anti-communists also believed that liberalism was a progenitor of communism, and because they shared the same substantive goals, was more often than not complicit in its spread. These men were appalled at the peace that followed World War II, particularly the fact that the Soviet Union had been handed most of Eastern Europe by Roosevelt and Churchill. They were concerned about the problems they anticipated from the growing strength of Soviet Russia, the fall of China to communism, and the lack of will on the part of the American and European liberals to stand up to the communists. They were also concerned about internal security and the fact that the federal government was being infiltrated by communists and other leftists to the detriment of our national interest. The anti-communist movement became a mainstay of American conservatism and attracted more people than any other part of the movement. The third group was concerned about the need to maintain American values and the value of tradition and faith for purposes of preserving Western civilization and culture. They saw a threat from permissiveness and vulgarity, believed in ethics and honor, in the power of the church, the need for traditional education and higher learning. In a word, they were concerned about the decline of the West and thought the way to reverse it was through tradition and order. These people included Russell Kirk, William Buckley, Richard Weaver, and many others. These men were not concerned with ideas only as an intellectual exercise or to better understand the world they were living in. They held practical ideas that challenged the status quo. They wanted to use their ideas to change the world. Although these conservatives did not think much of his theory of economics, they agreed with John Maynard Keynes, who said that, and I quote, "Ideas are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil." End of quote. They lamented what had happened to the United States, and indeed to the rest of the world during the first half of the 20th century. They believed that cultural and political liberalism was at odds with American ideals at home and abroad, and saw the assault on individual liberties, limited government, free markets, and Western culture, which ran counter to everything they believed in. Over the next 15 or so years, into the early 1960s, many of the conservatives who would dominate the stage for the balance of the 20th century developed a coherent and highly respected chorus of books, articles, lectures, and in the process set the stage for the upsurge in conservative politics that would follow. By the early 1960s, conservative organizations were being formed, magazines and book publishing companies were organized, a lecture circuit had been established, and the beginnings of a movement developed. Conservative politicians became more prominent, and in 1964, Barry Goldwater, Republican senator from Arizona, and the country's most popular conservative politician, was nominated to head the Republican ticket for president. Although he lost, and he lost by huge margins, his campaign solidified the movement politically, introduced thousands of bright, often young conservatives to national politics, and transformed the Republican Party from a moderate, middle-of-the-road party dominated by Easterners into a more conservative party largely dominated by people from the South and the West. At this point, as an aside, let me mention another driving force which motivated much of what conservatives were doing, and still does. It's a force which gave conservatives reason to become practically engaged in the real world of politics, education, the culture, the courts, and other institutions, and that force is reaction. Reaction to things going on in the world, largely being practiced one way or another by the left, which conservatives felt they needed to fight against. things that were going wrong, in other words, and needed to be fixed. These included communism, the expansion of socialism and the welfare state, regulation of free market capitalism, growing power of labor unions, activism in the courts, permissiveness, crime, and the breakdown of the family, deterioration of the schools and churches. During the next couple of decades, the 1960s and 70s, conservatives were being increasingly heard in politics. Conservative organizations grew, money was raised, new periodicals were started, a vibrant youth movement, largely in colleges and universities, became more prominent. And of course, in 1980, Republicans nominated and subsequently re-elected Ronald Reagan 4 years later, the most conservative politician ever to have reached a national standing in politics. You will hear much more about that in the subsequent articles in this course. As Reagan finished his second term in 1988, having included in his administration thousands of conservative appointees, the conservative movement had, over 40 years, transformed itself from an intellectual movement in the 1950s and 60s to a political movement in the 1960s and 70s and to a governing movement in the 1980s. In the process, it had solidified a coherent philosophy which still exists today. It is no exaggeration to say that most of today's upcoming conservatives, whether politicians, academics, activists, donors, writers, and the rest, got their start working for Ronald Reagan. Let me talk about the philosophy in today's world and compare that to what conservatives now believe relates to the four pillars I talked about at the beginning, and the concepts that evolved in America since the country was founded. The issues are really not particularly different. Obviously, what most conservatives today are concerned about reflects their concern about current issues, but the core beliefs that conservatives hold really stems from those four pillars I've been talking about. And I'm only going to take a few minutes here because I know over the rest of the semester you're going to be hearing a lot about current issues. But let me give you just a brief sketch. Many people now define themselves, and it's a rather new term, as constitutional conservatives. And it is, I think, a good starting point for what the tenets of modern conservatism are. First, conservatives today universally advocate a return to limited government based on the rule of law. We are experiencing an ongoing growth of government, the creation, if you will, of a government that can satisfy every need and desire of the populace, and it is at the forefront of conservative philosophy to object to such growth. Limited government, therefore, is the first belief. Needless to say, limited government signifies the ongoing struggle between government power and liberty. Ronald Reagan used to say that a government that can give you everything you want can also take away everything you have. A corollary to the first is economic freedom. Call it advocating free market capitalism, lower regulation of business, and economic activity and fiscal responsibility. Conservatives are generally tax cutters, as they believe high taxes not only enable the government and give it the resources to do things it should not be doing, but because high taxes stifle economic growth and progress. Conservatives tend to be more in favor of entrepreneurship than big business, which they recognize as often in cahoots with government for its own advantage and is anti-competition. An extension, if you will, of economic conservatism is libertarianism. Libertarians believe in an unfettered freedom, that unfettered freedom is possible, and strive for ultimate individual freedom and the removal of government restrictions on business, personal behavior, and all other individual activity. Ron Paul, of course, is a good example of a libertarian and is really the leader of what is quickly becoming a new movement. A third tenet of modern conservatism is the judicious use of the courts. The courts have assumed responsibilities and have made policies so far beyond the vision of the founders that the founders would not recognize the situation in the least bit today. What are called activist judges, judges who get into things and decide issues which are really outside of their jurisdiction or scope of power, populate the courts nowadays, and the judicial philosophy of federal judicial nominees can set off some of the greatest battles that go on in Congress. What conservatives want are rule of law judges who will decide cases according to the Constitution and the law, and not on their own philosophy and prejudices. Social conservatives today generally adhere to the previously mentioned positions. Family values are at the top of the list. Abortion, gay marriage, permissiveness, and related issues are prominent among social conservatives, as are things like education policy, adoption and foster care, and the intrusion into personal and family matters by the government. Many are evangelical Christians, and much of what social conservatives are concerned about stems from their faith. On foreign policy issues, conservatives are often divided. Traditionally, conservatives have believed that war should be avoided if at all possible, that troops should be used as a matter of last resort only, but that a strong national defense is the best offense. Peace through strength, if you will. But a new strand of conservatives joined the movement in the 1970s and the 1980s, the so-called neoconservatives. Many of these were former Democrats, liberals on domestic policy by anti-communists and hawks who merged with the other conservatives toward the end of the Cold War. Neoconservatives still tend to be more willing to use military power for purposes other than simply defending American interests, particularly such activities as nation building. But that's a big topic which would lend itself to an entire lecture or more. There are really no clear lines of demarcation between the different branches of conservatism. And in fact, most conservatives don't fit neatly into one or another camp. And for the most part, there are enough similarities that wherever they come from, conservatives can usually find enough to agree on, at least in the final analysis, to band together for the broader purpose. Let me end by talking about a document that was drafted about a year ago and signed initially by about 100 conservative leaders and subsequently by hundreds of thousands of other conservatives across the country. Called the Mount Vernon Statement, it set forth in broad terms beliefs that most conservatives could agree on. The Mount Vernon Statement starts off by reaffirming the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It stressed the fact that the Constitution unites all conservatives through what it described as natural fusion provided by American principles. The Constitution reminds economic conservatives, the document said, that morality is essential to limited government. It reminds social conservatives that unlimited government is a threat to moral self-government, and it reminds national security conservatives that energetic but responsible government is the key to America's safety and leadership role in the world. The policy agenda set forth by the Mount Vernon Statement was rather simple. It said the principles of limited government based on the rule of law should be applied to every proposal. Individual liberty is central to American politics and life. Free enterprise, individual entrepreneurs, and economic reforms should be grounded in market solutions. Support for the American national interest in advocating freedom and opposing tyranny in the world, while prudently considering what to do about it, and defense of family, neighborhood, community, and faith. In closing, let me just remind you again of those 4 pillars that I talked about at the beginning. And I think if you look at the current situation, if you think back to what even the politicians that are here in South Carolina campaigning for Saturday's primary will say, most of what they say will fit into somewhere into those 4 pillars of conservatism. Liberty, tradition and order, the rule of law, belief in God. And I think as you go through this course, as I say, I think Mallory's done a fantastic job putting an outline together. If you think of those 4 pillars as the other dozen or so people are talking about whatever it is they talk about, I think you'll see that they really are a good way to think about a simple way to think about the foundations, and that it will generally all fit together. So with that, let me stop and thank you very much.
Welcome back. Discussion. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you have a question, and let's start. First question. Somebody came up to me in the hall. Okay, please go ahead.
Well, my question concerns the 4th pillar, and I guess, would you feel that a non-Judeo-Christian worldview is incompatible with conservatism, or how does that fit in with conservatism?
Can you define what a non-Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview is?
Oh, I guess someone perhaps from, Japan or China, an Eastern worldview, or perhaps, I guess you could even go to, say, a postmodernist worldview, which wouldn't exactly be, I guess it still comes out of the Western the Western philosophical tradition, but it's not so much based in, the Judeo-Christian that there is natural law. I mean, the natural law thing seems to be a very important thing to the conservative movement, and I understand that. But, I guess, yeah, so maybe like a pantheism over in Eastern tradition, or like I said, postmodern, where you kind of forsaken the idea of those.
Well, there's certainly things that people would believe that would be consistent. In other words, they could believe in free markets. They could believe in limited government. Probably individually in many of the same things we believe. But I think for the general broader concept of what I like to think of conservatism is, you don't necessarily have to believe in God yourself, but you need to, I think, believe that man isn't the supreme person, the supreme being in the world, that there's something bigger than man. And I've always thought that one of the central components of conservative philosophy is that man is fallible, that man makes mistakes. And if you believe that man is on top of things, that man is the top of the heap, you sort of have to believe that man can't make mistakes, that man has all the answers. And I think I didn't really talk very much about liberalism as such, but I think the general concept of, the big concept of liberalism is that man can do anything. Man can, by government, can create heaven on earth. He can answer all of the problems that people have, and he can do it in such a way that there really aren't any mistakes or errors. It works. I mean, that's certainly what communists believe. It's in a way what socialists believe. Communism, of course, is based on the fact that it's atheistic, and it really requires that atheism so that they can create their heaven on earth, if you will. Certainly lots of socialists are also Christians. I don't think there's any question about that, but they still like to think that they can solve any issue. So I think that's sort of what the crux of it is. And for the general conservative philosophy, I think, therefore, you have to keep that component as part of it, that we're here as generally subservient to whatever it is that's greater than us.
Next question. Yes, sir.
So I'd like to caveat that question by, would you say the Eastern civilization, specifically the Muslim societies in the Middle East, would you say that they are mutually exclusive with modern conservatism? And if so, I know that's a large focus of our country, and if that's a direction that you could foresee that region going.
Well, I think, like anything else, there's no clear line. You know, they're Muslims and then they're Muslims, and there are certainly plenty of even Muslim states that are reasonably compatible with ours, and there are others that aren't. The strict Muslim view is pretty totalitarian, and we've always considered that a totalitarian state is anathema to what we believe. There have been a good many of them over the years, and there still are, but and we've even had been allies with some of them, of course. But in the modern world, you sort of do have to, in any world, you have to deal with other people, and obviously the Middle East, the Arab world, has it plays a major role in the world, and we have our differences, but we also have things that we can agree on. So, yeah, very different, certainly, but that doesn't mean that, I guess, you have to divide and never have anything to do with it.
I'd like to ask you all a question, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Is conservatism a Western civilization idea, concept, or is it broader than that? Any thoughts on that? You've read some Aristotle, you've read some Russell Kirk, you've read some Richard Weaver. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Anyone? Please, I see you're shaking your head. What are your thoughts? Does it go beyond Western civilization?
Well, I mean, I think it would be a logical, maybe an outgrowth of Western civilization, or certainly perhaps a foundation of Western civilization. But I guess one of the more one of the better qualities is that it has relevancy beyond Western civilization. It has relevancy for perhaps all of mankind.
Well, conservatism, as we looked at in some of the Russell Kirk readings, talks about man's need to be a political animal. It goes back to the Aristotelian thinking, and its pursuit of for man to flourish, he has to be in a group. Hobbes, which you'll read later on, talks about it being a necessary evil. An unnatural but unavoidable necessary evil. I guess my question is that for you is we go to Genesis and it puts it that man shouldn't live alone, and man should live with other people, and that's the political nature of man, and Aristotle talks about that as well. And conservatism is really the outgrowth, in many ways, from my point of view, of what man naturally does based on natural law. And conservatism can exist in other societies other than Western civilization, but it may not look like our conservatism. And I'd love to have some comments on that from you, please.
Conservatism, as a broad definition, is probably subjective to the society that's in. And throughout history, the society trying to return to its traditions. For example, maybe Japan in the early 1900s, when they do an anti-Western, and they try to return to their previous traditions, would be their idea of conservatism.
Is conservatism an ideology? Yes, sir.
Well, H. Stuart Hughes is quoted as saying conservatism is the negation of ideology, and I think that kind of invokes natural law, the rights of all men, and I think it might even invoke, hands-off kind of laissez-faire. I'm interested in hearing, your opinion of what you think that means as a prominent figure in the conservative movement.
Well, the term ideology is used quite a bit, particularly by non-conservatives talking about, and even among conservatives, I guess, talking about the conservative ideology. Other conservatives say, no, it's not an ideology. An ideology is a rigid set of beliefs that encompasses everything. And conservatism doesn't do that. And coming back to the discussion of politics, I think that one thing that conservatives believe, although politics is important, it isn't everything. And there is probably, in today's world, there's a sort of a sense that politics is everything. And that, I think, is a derivation of what I just said, that government and politics can solve any of our problems. Bill Clinton used to be pretty clear about the fact that everything is politics. It doesn't matter what it is, everything can be solved by politics. And conservatives believe that, well, politics is fine, but there's another side of life beside politics that doesn't have anything to do with the government, and that are all the other traditional things that we know about. So, no, I guess I would argue that conservatism is not an ideology, although we get accused of being ideologues.
So given that, my next question to all of you and to our guest is, can the conservative movement, what is conservative change? Or is it static?
Both. I mean, the principles don't change. The big, broad liberty, rule of law, tradition, order, things like that, those are the things that are way behind it. Certainly it changes politically. It changes as you go from decade to decade, depending what the issues are, what the concerns are, whether you're at war, whether you're at peace, whether you're in a depression, in an economic growth mode or whatever. And because, as I said, a lot of what conservatives do is reaction to what other things that are happening, things that are going wrong. So you listen to politicians today talking about conservatism. Frankly, a lot of them don't know what they're talking about. I mean, they will call themselves conservative, but if you bore down with them as to why they are, they can't tell you. All they know is that there are certain things that they're trying to get done which equate to some side of conservatism, but philosophically they're not really conservatives at all. There are other people that you will talk to who claim to be liberals, but if you start going into what they actually believe, they'll say, well, maybe I'm actually a conservative.
So I guess, and you'll read this later in some of the Burke readings, so I guess that changes can occur, but when they do occur, it's taking a step back and looking at, as our guest Mr. Regnery said so well, it's taking a look at the first principles. And we go back to those first principles as conservatives, and then move forward again with the changes necessary by the times. Yes, Mr. Faust.
You mentioned about how the Constitution was one of the most perfect, I guess, one of the closest to perfect documents that we have. But the Constitution has been an ever-changing document. I mean, from when we started to the way it is today, there's been amendments made to the Bill of Rights, greater powers given to the central government, taken away from the states. So how would you say that the Constitution has moved towards the better or worse off as far as conservatism is concerned? And you talked about how the amendment process is very arduous and time-consuming and can take a very long time. But do you think that it's been enough, like difficult enough with some of the amendments that have been made? Are we really taking the time to take a step back and look at what we're doing?
All very good questions. First of all, let's define the Constitution. The Constitution is a document, okay? When I was in law school, we used to talk about the Constitution, but we never read the Constitution. To law professors, that what the Constitution is what the Supreme Court said it is, which is a very different thing than what it actually is. I mean, as I mentioned in my talk, you talk about religious liberty, about the First Amendment. What the founders actually said and what they believed they were saying is totally different from what the Supreme Court now defines as religious liberty. And you can see the evolution of that from the first cases in the 1950s through, there's about 8 or 10 of these cases that keep chipping away at what the Constitution did. And that's the same, I mean, the Commerce Clause is another thing that was, that has been broadened and broadened to the point where some people now think that it allows the government to tell you you have to do it by health care. I mean, that is being argued on the Commerce Clause. And so, you know, the Constitution itself, the document is the same. Certainly there's some amendments. Those amendments were done with the proper process, so they were done at the will of the people and presumably reflected what the people wanted. I mean, prohibition here's a good example. Prohibit the consumption or the sale of alcohol, but then undo it because it didn't work. I mean, that's probably the most egregious example of the process really not being used for what it was intended. But there are other amendments that were certainly the post-Civil War amendments, the 14th Amendment and those, which had a very definite purpose. They've been interpreted differently by the courts, certainly than they were written. But and then, of course, there's also this major argument that goes on: is the Constitution a static document? I mean, is it interpreted as Justice Scalia says, originally, as the founders originally intended, or is it this living document that Justice Breyer claims it is that can be changed? And you know, it's certainly a good debate. It's a legitimate debate. And there are sort of 4 members of the Supreme Court now that say it's originalist, and 4 say it's not, and 1 that sort of swings back and forth. So, you know, and that's the way the process works. I mean, could it be any better? I don't know. I mean, the Constitution actually has served us, I think, very well. Over 200 years, I don't think there's any Constitution in the history of the world that's lasted for that long. It doesn't still, it's brought up constantly. I mean, it is still the bedrock, although it's interpreted differently. There's still a great deal to be said for it, that it is the thing that keeps the United States going more or less in a straight line.
Sure, go ahead.
With the New Deal and the birth of the administrative state, where now we have you know, government bureaucracies and other agencies issuing regulations that then in effect have the rule of law, even though it's not really stated in the Constitution. You brought up prohibition. at last Monday's debate, Ron Paul made the comment that, you know, back in the early 20th century, they had enough reverence for the Constitution that they actually went and, you know, made an amendment to outlaw, you know, alcohol consumption, and later repealed it. Do you think that we're moving away from a respect of the Constitution today, that we don't, you know, we're not going to such extremes as constitutional amendments to get things done anymore?
Well, there's a huge resurgence in interest in the Constitution, which has happened really since the 1980s. The Constitution really was not talked about very much before probably the Warren Court in the early 50s. You know, people sort of assumed the Constitution was there. There were some things that Roosevelt tried to do during the New Deal. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But the Constitution itself, I guess really during the Reagan years, it was sort of resurrected as the standard law of the country that people started talking about. As I mentioned in the talk, the conservative legal community, the Federal Society particularly, has made the Constitution, you know, a topic of everyday conversation. The Tea Party talks. The Tea Party actually have classes on the Constitution across the country where they study it and they tear it apart and put it back together and talk about what the courts have done to it. I mean, there's a huge interest in the Constitution, in other words, that didn't exist 20 years ago. The amendment process, I don't know. It's been a while since there's been an amendment. Actually, the last amendment was added. I don't know if you knew that, was submitted in 1789 and never got ratified until, what, 5 years ago, something like that, and they put it in the Constitution. But so there haven't been any. I mean, there have been discussions about it, but one thing I guess I could say that is, I think, a point that's worth noting is that the country, in many ways, is far more polarized now than it's ever been before. It's very, very difficult to get anything through Congress that, as we've seen. And I cannot imagine that a constitutional amendment, unless it was something that everybody that was really non-controversial, I don't know what that would be, could get through both houses of Congress now, or be ratified by the states. Simply because the parties are much further apart than they used to be. People are much more ideological, to use that term again, on both sides. So the political polarization is probably enough to dampen any discussion even of trying to have a constitutional amendment. I mean, people talk about it every now and then, but I don't know when the last time one ever got to first base was. It's been a while.
I'd like to pose a question. Do conservatives think that Western civilization is in decline? And if so, when did that decline begin? Anybody have any ideas of that? Any one of you? Please.
So I'll take a stab at this. I think we're getting kind of wrapped around the axle with conservatives and domestic policy and domestic politics, but I kind of, to go back to your other question and this one, conservatism is a philosophy and a state of mind, so to speak. So, you know, when I was asking that initial question about Eastern civilization and everything, I think you can interpret a conservative philosophy on that civilization or on those governments in particular. But with our decline that you were talking about, I think that obviously the issues right now in hand in our country with same-sex marriages and abortion rights, I think that the pillars of religion play a big factor into that. But on the same token, an economic conservative is going to take a different perspective and say that, you know, well, that's not a good example right now, I guess, economic-wise. But I think depending on the time, the state of mind and the state of affairs has a lot to do on the philosophy that people can take as far as the decline of society goes.
Any other thoughts? Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it would probably depend on who you're talking with. Certainly someone like Rick Santorum, always touting social issues, you know, is perhaps maybe the greatest concern right now. I think he would be one more privy to say we are in decline because of the, you know, expanding abortion rights, gays and lesbians, things like that. But again, I think, you know, different conservatives would be more, it'd be easier for them to say that than others.
Just moving away from the social side of it, if you just look at the decentralization of power in the government that we have today, I mean, that would certainly indicate a decline, and seeing a decline in the government. And I mean, I guess one of the things you could look at and say that this is a point where we started to go off was moving away from the gold standard and saying that letting government accumulate debt. I mean, because debt made it so that way the people lost control of the government through paying taxes, which is something we talked that you mentioned, sir, about how conservatives like lower taxes. That's also because lower taxes should mean lower government.
I'm going to suggest that you could take a look back to the 14th century with William of Aiken when he introduced something called nominalism, where it rejects the very nature, the truths set forth by nature, and basically says the truths set forth by the monarch are the truths solely. And I think that is a very important period. And I think we go back to that when we really reject certain truths that are fundamental. And if you look at Machiavelli, which you've all probably read in other courses, the prince basically makes up the truths as he sees fit. And it's not the pursuit of good that's driving man, as he believes it. It's only the fear of death, and that begins, in my opinion, and it's open for argument, interpretation by many other people. But that's how Western civilization begins to decline.
Couldn't just say it goes back to Julius Caesar long before that too? I mean, they had the same issues.
They did.
I mean, I guess you could say Western civilization began its decline when it began.
Aristotle, we talk about. Anybody have any get much out of what we looked at in Aristotle? What is Aristotle? How does he distinguish the business of politics from the business of wealth acquisition? First of all, I think he sees. Well, anybody have an idea on that? You've read a little bit of that. Go ahead.
Yes, my response isn't so much focused on the wealth acquisition. I guess it ties in. But I thought it was interesting how he pointed to the parallels between the basic family unit in a society and then the overall politics of that state.
Yes, he believes economics is with the oikos, then productivity is with the family unit, absolutely.
Right. And I guess what struck me, I forget which reading it was, but there's another reading where it was talking about conservatism in different societies and looking at the different types of family units in those different societies changed the flavor of the economics of that state in that area. For example, it talked about in more places with more of a tribal background and more of a collective background versus places with more of an individualistic one, and how that changed the way the state did things based on going back to the family. And so I thought that was very interesting, and it made me think that I guess the conservatism takes different forms in different places. Because in all situations, I feel like it goes back to the basic family unit in whatever society we're in. And I feel like those 4 pillars you were talking about are the same 4 pillars that, you know, the basic family rests on.
Well, then relating that to the decline of the West, where half of all babies born in the United States are born out of wedlock. In Europe, it's even less, or higher that are out of wedlock. Where in Europe, the average family has 1 child. People aren't reproducing themselves. What does that say about the decline of the West? If in fact the family unit is the thing that is the structure, the basic structure of Western civilization, you've got in Western civilization family units that are deteriorating. Does that say that Western civilization is deteriorating too?
Yes, possibly.
I guess it does.
I think it does. Remember, yes, Mr. Faust.
Go ahead, sir.
What I glean, and we all get different things from the readings, but what Aristotle, the Aristotelian thought, from my perspective, is that politics creates conditions for humans to flourish, and that's what the political process should be doing. It should not be driving humankind in a particular way or path. And I think that's where you see the conservative tradition coming out of. But please, Mr. Faust, go ahead.
I was just going to comment about how that decline can also be, you could also see a decline in, I guess, religious belief, which is something that we talked about here. But I'd also like to hear your thoughts on enlightened self-interest, as far as maybe not taking the place of religion, but supplementing it. Or is it a failure also to communicate enlightened self-interest? That people are worried too much about what they're getting right away rather than what benefits the community? I mean, for instance, paying your taxes for a school system even though you don't have kids. The idea that the kids are in school rather than now causing problems, and also you're educating those kids to better your country and therefore be able to pay for you when you're older and can't work anymore.
So the common good versus your own individual good?
Kind of, I mean, so enlightened self-interest versus, not versus religion, but as a alternative to religion in conservatism.
Well, individually, as I say, liberty says you can do that if you want. Now, that's part of being. Liberty says you don't have to do these things. If you want to go off and consume yourself in self-interest, you can do that too. But for the broader society, for the culture, obviously that doesn't work. I mean and arguably, I suppose that's a situation that some people would say anyway exists today, which may be why they see the West declining. But
I guess you're bringing up a point, and you make a very good point, and that is that, I mean, there is a need, and I mean, politics, the need for politics is to provide for the common good. But just as the Common Commerce Clause, once in our Constitution, gets interpreted and grossly overutilized, sometimes the common good becomes something that is grossly over. I mean, what is the common good? National security, being safe. That would be a common good.
Of course, there are lots of things that are done in the name of the common good that aren't.
That's what I'm getting at. And you may want to, please.
Well, yeah, it's a very difficult line to draw, because what's the common good for one person is not the common good for somebody else or for one segment of society or another. And let's just talk about the growth of government, for example, and the expansion of government power. It's generally done in the name of the common good. We're going to give these benefits to this group of people that's going to make society a better place. But it's usually done at the expense of another group or another factor in society. And you know what? One of the, just maybe a little bit different, but one of the things that is a factor that always comes is the rule of unintended consequences. I mean, that's maybe another way of saying it. That, and the more things that government does, the more likely it is that they're going to have unintended consequences. I mean, I think it's a good way of measuring the growth of government, all the things that people see the government ought to be doing, and you look back and see what the consequences actually were. I mean, there are millions of examples. It had nothing to do with what they set out to do. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but
I think you have to distinguish the common good from an aggregate of individual goods. And I think that's where we get very confused. Additional questions?
My question's moving more towards foreign policy. You talked about conservatism involved in, as it relates to foreign policy, like in terms of like development is something that conservatives really wouldn't be in favor of. They're more, it seems like, more limited government or limited involvement in international affairs. So in this increased era of globalization, how do you think that's going to, I guess, play out?
well, traditionally conservatives believe that you don't get entangled in foreign issues if you don't have to. You know, that you maintain trade and with other countries, but you know, unless the American experience anyway, unless there's a direct relationship to what American interests are, you don't get involved in it. And you only do get involved in it when you've exercised all your other options and you have expended everything you can diplomatically and economically and all the other forces you've got, and so on. And so you don't send troops overseas, for example, until there's no other option, and it's only in the best interest of the United States. Now that's been abused, of course, many times. In terms of globalization, I mean, that globalization in a way has been going on for a long time. I mean, certainly it's obviously the world is a smaller place and there's much more trade and so on and so forth, but we still have the same issues between countries. And then the question is, when do we get involved militarily? The last 10 years, I think, will serve historically as a wonderful example of, was this the right thing to do or not? Getting involved in Iraq and Afghanistan particularly. I'm not sure there's any good answer yet. There was major debate within the conservative community, the contemporary political community, as we did that. I think that generally conservatives thought that initially we did the right thing. As the Iraq war extended on year after year after year, this was something that had no place, many conservatives would say, for American foreign policy. Others said, you know, expand it into the next country. So that's a big argument that still goes on among conservatives.
Yes, please.
Sir, do you see a distinction between military spending and actual defense spending, where you have, I guess you would have politicians who would be more classified as economic conservatives say, you know, all military spending isn't good spending. We shouldn't have so many bases worldwide, where you could also counter that with the neocon argument where, you know, most spending with the military is good spending and is indeed defense spending.
Well, it's an argument that goes back a long way. I mean, in the late 40s and 1950s, when I was talking about earlier, the libertarians thought that the anti-communists and the national defense conservatives were all wet because money spent on defense was just expanded government. It enabled government to get bigger, and it was money that was wasted. It was raising taxes and cutting into productivity and all the other things. So that's an old argument, certainly. Another question that we really haven't talked about is, with defense spending and anything else, it's the vested interests that become involved in any government spending and keep it going. I mean, after all, defense spending is what, 3-4% of GNP now, so it's relatively small as compared to lots of other things. And I remember being in a meeting with Don Rumsfeld one day, and I asked him about cutting the defense budget, and he said, "There's no room to cut it whatsoever. I mean, we can afford. This country's rich enough to be able to afford what we spend on defense. So whatever whatever we're doing that is not productive and so on, we can afford to do it simply because we have that much money." But other people would, and I think that make a very good case that a lot of defense spending is controlled by a relatively small number of defense contractors who have inroads into Congress, and they keep it going. I mean, they want to keep building airplanes because it means it's good for their bottom line. It doesn't mean that the airplanes are going to do anything for foreign policy. You know, there's another, let me mention another issue that I think is a really interesting one. Some of you may have seen a piece that the American Spectator published about a year ago called the ruling class. And it talked about, it divided the country into two segments more in a different way than I've ever seen it done before. He talked about the ruling class being about 30% of the population, made up of people that are largely graduates of elite universities across the country, most of whom are either in the legal community, big business, Wall Street, academics, press. Most of them have a vested interest in seeing big government because it's good for them. The rest of the country, the other 60%, he put into what he called the country class. And those are the people that are earning a living, going about their business. They don't have anything to do with the government. He said increasingly the country's polarized between these two people. And if you extend that argument into defense spending, you can see that the ruling class, basically this relatively small number of people, have a vested interest in defense spending being as big as it can be. Because what does it do? I mean, it's obviously, it's a wonderful thing for Wall Street because they're financing it. They are involved in starting new companies and all the other things that provide this stuff to the Pentagon. It's a good thing for big business, of course, for all sorts of consultants, for lobbyists, and whatnot, and on and on, which doesn't really, as I say, have anything to do with, I mean, it does have something to do with defense spending, but that's not the reason they're doing it. So does that divide the country into those other two segments? I think to some extent it does. And of course, that argument extends to everything else the government does. And I'm not sure that we're not getting a little bit off point, but whatever government program there is, there are vested interests that want to see it continue because it's good for them. It's good for their pocketbook. And it's good for their position of power and whatever. And it does make, once you get into a concept of big government, as we have, it's very difficult to shrink it back because you have all these vested interests that are going to keep it going. I mean, that's why, for example, over the last year, you recall a year ago when new members of the House of Representatives were coming in and they had all these great things they were going to do, that they were going to cut this back and cut that back and get involved here and there. And you look back and virtually none of it's happened. And it's, I think, largely because they're encountering people from their districts, people that gave them money, people that voted for them, that they realize have some sort of an interest, and that they lose interest themselves in fighting those battles.
I'm going to pose another question to you all. There's basically three types of government. There's a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a republic that I guess you can again glean from some of the readings of Aristotle. What happens when each of those goes bad? And remember, each of them in their own right is not a bad form of government. If the monarch is a good monarch, if the aristocracy is good, it could be a very good form of government. What happens when each of those go bad, including a republic? Please.
I think it goes back to some of the fears you see in the Federalist Papers, where they talk about, you know, the fear of faction versus essentially the common good. And the hope for any government, whether it be the monarch with the philosopher king, or the aristocracy with the there's a French word for it, noble or something, or you know, the republic, that we hope that the collective society can produce, you know, through debate and whatever, can produce the best truth, the best good for everyone. And then the danger is when people decide, well, it'd be much better if I just took care of myself and my friends and forget everybody else.
Well, I'll pose this to you, that when a monarchy goes bad, what you have is total tyranny. When an aristocracy goes bad, you have an oligarchy. When a republic goes bad, you tend to have a democracy, which may not be the best form of government for everybody. It is the best form of government for 50.1%. And just think about that, and we'll talk about that later on in some of the other sessions. But I just wanted to bring that up. Also, does anybody have any ideas on what the word, what does a conservative conserve? Russell Kirk talks about this a little bit. Does anybody remember some of that? What does a conservative conserve? Anybody want to comment on that? I see. Yeah, please.
Well, he talks about it's kind of well, Lincoln said it's adherence to the old and tried rather than you know, the new and the untried. And I believe you mentioned earlier how the accumulated practical knowledge should be given more weight rather than abstract reasoning. So I guess it kind of goes in line with the whole, you know, we've been around for a while, we know what works, and let's stick with that rather than being, you know, imprudent or something like that.
Yeah, I talked about the common law, and I think it's a wonderful example of the way the accumulated wisdom of mankind sort of gets to the right place. Now, I understand, you all probably understand what the common law is and how it came about, but let me just give you just a thumbnail. I mean, the common law is the accumulated decisions of hundreds of years of those everyday cases that involve people stealing somebody else's cow or trespassing on somebody else's land, or man and woman that don't get along, or whatever it is. I mean, all the problems that people have over the course of history, millions of times when they're decided, you begin to get a rule that one judge leans on what the last judge said, and as eventually you get the rule that follows, people think, the natural law. That is the ethical, correct position that people should be taking. That went on in England from the time of the Magna Carta, basically until, well, it still does. There was a big question as to whether the common law would become adopted in the United States at the time of the Constitution. And every state eventually did adopt it except for Louisiana, which doesn't. But it's...
I'm not going to comment on Louisiana.
Okay. It is a... as I say, with the accumulated wisdom of all these practical things and how they were decided, is a measure of that can't be matched anywhere else. So I guess the other place I think that the same sort of idea comes forth is in Christian doctrine. If you look back from the beginning of the Christian tradition 2,000 years ago, and the accumulated wisdom of all of the writings and all of the thought and all the other things that have gone on, one building on the other.
I'd go far saying Judeo-Christian even.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Sure, it's certainly in the Old Testament it's the same issue, that eventually people think that, well, we've gotten to the right place with it. So those are the things I think that you're trying to preserve. It's the things that have existed for a very long time, which have rejected the unethical, the dishonesty, all the other things that were bad, and found the things that were good, and how society lives by those things and the rules that they have accordingly.
I'm going to take a little bit from, first of all, any other questions before I give a very quick summation? Happy to take some more questions.
Do you think, in a micro sense, it may be detrimental to go off the accumulated opinions? We have the example in U.S. history of, Plessy v. Ferguson sanctioning separate but equal, and then for decades that was followed until, of course, Brown v. Board. So are there any caveats to following that, letter of the law all the time? Precedent and all of that entails?
Well, that nothing's perfect, I guess. I mean, there's certainly precedents in the law that you have to live with. That's a good example. Plessy versus Ferguson was. There are a good many others of the way the system works. You have 9 judges, and you might not have just the right ones at some point that decide a case one way or another. And eventually, as you see, those things are usually overturned. I mean, there are probably some cases that haven't been, but a good many of them have been, which I think speaks to the question of the wisdom of a long period of time and the accumulated wisdom that helps to rule on those things. But yeah, sure, there are always going to be errors. I mean, nothing is perfect. What do they say? That this is not the best form of government, or not it's a lousy form of government, but better than anything else that's ever been used.
I'd like you to think about this going into, and by the way, any other questions before I do this? Yeah, okay, please.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the three groups of the people joining the conservative movement when it was taking off in the 60s. Those for the fear of socialism or the communism or the values degrading. And you mentioned a lot of youthful energy around the time that Barry Goldwater ran. And it seems to like today there's a lot of youthful energy in the conservative movement as well. So I was curious if you thought, are we still reacting to the same threats, or are the threats new now? What do you think is, I guess, driving people to join the conservative movement or be conservatives today?
Well, it's in many ways. I mean, you don't have the communist threat, so that that really is set aside. But the other two are really the growth of government and the decline of Western civilization, if you will. I mean, maybe that's too broad a way of putting it. But coming back to the first one, it is the stifling of a free enterprise economy by the growth of government and all the other things that come with it. I think that's the number one issue. But certainly among social conservatives, it's got a pretty interesting history how it happened. I mean, the social conservatives really weren't a factor until the late 70s. Evangelical Christians largely were in the South and the West. They were not involved in politics. They mostly lived in smaller towns. They went about their lives, and they weren't concerned about what happened in the rest of the country. And as in the 70s, as they began to see their life coming apart, they saw permissiveness as a problem. They saw the churches were being regulated by the government. They would have schools, and the church schools was the big issue that actually got them interested in getting involved. Starting in 1979, 1980, they began to realize that if they didn't get involved in politics, and their way of life was going to be gone. And there was one regulation that the Health and Human Services Administration agency department, I think, issued on private schools, on church schools, that said that they would be taxed unless they could show that they were not segregated, and segregation had nothing to do with it, and it was a test that was impossible to prove. So they were going to start taxing these schools, and that one incident sent people through the roof, and obviously there were a good many other people that saw this as an opportunity. The conservative movement needed foot soldiers, as they said, and these were foot soldiers who were out there who were available, so they went out and recruited them and got them in. And actually, interestingly, in the 1976 election, as I recall, evangelicals voted for Carter over, who ran against Carter in 76? Dole, right? They voted for the Democrats, in other words, by about 75%. By 1980, when Carter ran again, they were voting for Ronald Reagan. And it was because of these things that the government had done to them, which they were offended by, and they became organized. So that part of the conservative movement basically then came in. You remember they ran candidates. They became in the 80s. They became very active. Who was the guy that ran for president? The talk show, the radio.
Buchanan?
No, the evangelical. Pat Robertson, right. It became very active. Excuse me. Oop, that was my recording thing.
I'll get that for you.
Okay.
Are we okay still?
Is that all right? Still recording? Okay. Sorry. So anyway, they became a significant factor in the conservative movement, and they are still concerned with the same thing. I mean, you listen to what Rick Santorum says. He's concerned about families. He's concerned about permissiveness, about decency, all those kind of things, and those are the first thing in his on his agenda. And it's as I say, I think that the evangelical vote is about a third of the Republican vote now. Actively, they're probably more than that. Among the Tea Party, I would say that probably at least half of them, if not, no, maybe less than that. Tea Party is more concerned with economics and so
more libertarian.
Yeah, so those are really the two big things. There are lots of others, obviously, but those are the two overwhelming issues that drive the debate right now.
Any other? Okay, last question, and then I'm going to sum up a little bit.
Going back to Aristotle and the family, he talks a lot about moderation as an individual and as a small unit. I think the Federalists take it to another level and really spoke to prudence in government. I think we've now evolved into a society that our government doesn't really act with prudence or make decisions with a lot of prudence. I think that's a huge canon of the conservative movement. How do you see us combating that in the modern conservative movement? And specifically right now, we're looking for a leader to take us into this, the next decade, the next couple decades. How How do you suggest finding that in a leader right now?
If I could answer that one, I guess I'd go to the head of the pack, wouldn't I? You know, actually, we are in an interesting situation in 2012 that with as much energy as the conservative movement has, probably more than it's ever had before, we've got all these new people that are joining and that are becoming interested, that there isn't somebody who is their leader. And you look at the candidates, you know, nobody's particularly happy with any of them. There are certainly a good many people that are not yet there that are coming along. There are probably half a dozen governors, young governors, that show a great deal of promise. Many of them have big tests to go through still. Other political people, we do tend to look to other politicians for our leaders. Sometimes you wish we didn't, but that's the way the process works. So that's about the best I can say. I mean, you know, what do you do to instill leadership in people? I think a lot of what you guys are doing right here says a lot about that. But
I see kind of a difficult situation where we got a lot of energy, and it's hard to practice prudence with a lot of energy in government. And do you see that as maybe a problem we'll see in these next few years?
well, as I say, government as it gets bigger it has a momentum that's very hard to control. The 2010 congressional class is an interesting group of people. I mean, you've got a good many of them who have never been involved in politics before. Take Ron Johnson, for example, senator from Wisconsin, who was in business. He gave a speech in August of 2010, I think, to a Tea Party group, or maybe it was in a little bit before that, but it wasn't that long before the election, just because he was a prominent member of the community. And somebody said, you know, you ought to run for the Senate. He said, what would I want to do that for? I've got a great family here and a business. I don't want to do that. Well, he decided to do it and beat an incumbent by a good bit, and is now, you know, a prominent member of the freshman class of the Senate. He's the kind of person that traditionally you haven't had in politics, and I think it's very refreshing. And I think some of those people, probably some that you haven't even heard of, will emerge as, if they're encouraged to do that. I mean, a good many of them last time showed that they could and could actually win, which encourages others to do it. So whatever happens this year could be very interesting, and some of those people will emerge undoubtedly as leaders.
Okay. Conservative, conserve. What does it really mean? What are the fundamentals? What is the foundation of conservatism? I would say that it's really the things that we inherit. It's what we appreciate. It's a state of affairs that we recognize. It's our culture. It's our politics. It's an artifact of our culture. It is something that's been passed down from generation to generation. Our conservatism is different than that of Italy. Ours is creativity and competition. Theirs is a different tradition. So when we're thinking about it, let's think about conservatism as something that's been given to us by our forefathers for many, many, many centuries past, and here for the past 200 years. I thank you for being here for this first lecture. I thank our visitors and guests, but most of all, I thank Alfred S. Regnery. What an honor and a delight to have him here. We are so honored by your presence, and we thank you for your wisdom.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here.